Before we begin, I just want to note that the person I'm covering has semi-disowned the video of theirs I'm about to commentate on in their own words. However, I still have enough issues with it to where I wanted to make a commentary on it just to mention them all. Either way, just know I do not hold this video against the person who made it. I'm also going to be skipping the intro because it's nothing more than context. All you need to know is that CyberDragon is covering a video where somebody lists their least favorite weapon in every Mega Man game. I'm also skipping the Mega Man 1 part because all it is set up for a point later in the video. All you need to know is the guy CyberDragon is covering picked the weapon you got from Bomb Man as the worst one in the first Mega Man.
Mega Man 2, despite being generally more well-polished than Mega Man 1, has a higher chance of having worse weapons due to the simple fact that Mega Man 2 introduced the idea of having 2 additional Robot Masters in the game, meaning there are now 8 instead of 6. Honestly, I think Mega Man 2 potentially has the most balanced weapons just because it has some of the best in the entire series along with some of the worst. We all know Metal Man's weapon could easily be considered the best Mega Man weapon of all time, which means it's probably not going to qualify for this specific list, but luckily there are other culprits. Flash Man's weapon kinda sucks because while it does freeze time, which is nice, you can't shoot or even really kill enemies while time is frozen, and also time is only frozen for like 15 seconds max. I can't say this is the worst weapon in the game though, because not only did Mega Man end up making worse knockoffs of this weapon throughout the future of the series, but there's also a specific spot in Mega Man 2 where it is intended for you to use your time-stopping powers in order to have an easier time beating the game. I personally never use it because I like the Quick Man lasers, but I can't call this the worst weapon when so many innocent Mega Man fans need this weapon just to beat Quick Man.
You forget to mention that Time Stopper drains the entire weapon energy bar in one go.
Okay, first off, your audio is way louder than the person you're covering, and that is incredibly noticeable and somewhat distracting. Your background music's also a tad on the loud side to the point where it occasionally drains out your voice. As for your point, why should he mention that exactly? How would that change his point in the slightest? You don't explain, you just include this extra detail about the weapon he didn't mention while criticizing him for not bringing it up. I actually agree with the second part of this interjection, so I'm just skipping past that entirely.
Your point about how it is useful for new players doesn't make sense either because the boss of the level with the lasers, Quick Man, is weak to Time Stopper. So either A, you save Time Stopper for the boss, or B, grind more weapon energy from the Sniper Joes at the end of the level. Even then, a full Time Stopper only takes away 50% of Quick Man's health.
And that disproves the idea that it's not helpful in that specific circumstance and invalidates his point. How exactly? You are right that if you use Flash Stopper at the lasers, you do have to grind if you want to use it against Quick Man later in the level, but what if the player in question is fine with grinding? You also mentioned how it only takes away half of Quick Man's health, but what if the player only needs help taking away half of their health? And isn't that still an improvement over not having his weakness in the first place? Yeah, this is just another case of I don't get what your point is supposed to be.
Bubble Man's weapon is also fairly weak because it's slow, stays on the ground, and does nothing to 99% of enemies it makes contact with, but the 1% of enemies it does affect happens to contain the final boss of the game, which can only be injured by Bubble Ed, so we literally need it to beat the game. Also, Heat Man is weak to Bubble Ed, which is interesting, I guess.
So it's not the worst because it's needed to beat the final boss? If anything, that makes the weapon worse because with the way you describe it, the player would have a borderline worthless weapon for most of the game.
Well, first off, who's to say there aren't weapons in Mega Man 2 that he finds entirely useless, or at least more useless than Bubble Lead? Spoiler alert, there are. And second off, who's to say he has it for most of the game? Mega Man is a series where you can fight the Robot Masters in any order you want. If you fought Bubble Man last, you wouldn't have it for most of the game. So this is just an assumption on your part.
Your point would have been strengthened just a tiny bit if you mentioned other enemies weak to Bubble Lead, like Springers and Kaminari Goros. Granted, it still wouldn't have made your point better because the reasons you described of why it isn't that great of a weapon would still apply here. It would have added to your argument.
So he could have brought up something that wouldn't have improved his point? Seriously, that's how this comes off. You mentioned that he could have brought up other enemies who are weak to bubble lead, only to say it wouldn't improve his argument. So why would he bring them up? And isn't it a good thing he didn't if it wouldn't have made his point stronger? You do say it would have added to his point, but given you just said it wouldn't have made it any better, what would it have added other than time it took him to make it?
Crashman's bomb weapon is kind of annoying to use, but undeniably useful.
This is another interjection that I agree with the beginning of, so I'm speeding through it.
Don't even think about suggesting how it's useful because it's needed to be booby trapped, because it was programmed to be that way.
This is unlike everything else in Mega Man 2, which is completely independent from how it's programmed. What?
And it ended up making the boss worse because you have to be precise with your shots and figure out which walls to break and which to not break, along with taking most of that weapon's energy to defeat Booby Trap.
Quick note about the graphic on screen, it gets something wrong. You actually only get 7 uses of the Crash Bomber, not 8.
Heatman's weapon is awkward to use because you have to charge it up, but it also one-hit kills Woodman in the American version and two-hit kills him in the Japanese version, so there's no way that's the worst weapon.
Again, this interjection starts out with a point that is perfectly fine.
Also, that reason doesn't make sense because by your logic, Hyper Bomb is useful because it kills Gutsman in 3 hits. Just because a boss is weak to a weapon in that way doesn't automatically make it useful.
But he didn't claim it was useful. He just said that it wasn't the worst one in this specific game. That's an entirely different statement.
Airman and Quickman's weapons are just undeniably decent, which means the worst weapon must go to Woodman's Leaf Shield. Now, in theory, this weapon is not too bad, and there are still a couple of areas where this weapon can shine, but it's just not good. It's slow, you can't run with it, meaning if you're going to shoot and run at the same time, you will never have the shield around you for more than a couple of frames, and your weapon energy will just run out. Admittedly, there is an area in Wily 2 where I use this item a lot just for convenience sake, but that's the only time in the entire game I use it, and you can also just use Flashman's weapon here with an even better effect. Woodman's weapon is also Airman's weakness, and you would think since Airman is fairly difficult, that in itself would add value to Woodman's weapon, but it's just straight up easier to beat Airman with the plain old dude than the Leaf Shield. So do with that information what you will, I suppose. But yeah, Leaf Shield is the worst weapon in Mega Man 2. Somebody please go tell the guy who wrote I can't defeat Airman, by the way, because he's gonna freak out if we don't tell him in time.
While I agree with some of the cons with Leaf Shield, in fact I'll add to it that it only shields you against small enemies, slow isn't a good reason. Going off of your footage and playing Mega Man 2 using Leaf Shield, it flies off at a good speed. Plus it's faster to use than Atomic Fire and Crash Bomber, and more enemies take damage to it than Bubble Lead.
First off, you saying it goes at a decent speed is entirely subjective, and really the only thing I can say in response is, this guy doesn't agree. However, I want to zero in on your comparisons with other weapons because he already explained why he felt Leaf Shield to be inferior to them. Specifically, he notes that Atomic Fire kills Woodman in 1 hit, while also saying it's actually more difficult to defeat Airman with his weakness than it would be to just fight him with the regular pea shooter. He says that Crash Bomber is useful, albeit that's a very vague reason, but it's a reason nonetheless. And regarding Bubble Lead, he specifically singled out its role in it being the thing that defeats the final boss as what made it not his pick for the absolute worst. It is true that some of these drawbacks do exist in other weapons or are worse in them. However, he already said why exactly it is that he's not going with them earlier in this segment.
Sparkman's weapon is just too underwhelming to use without developing severe depression. Honestly, Sparkman's weapon is probably the worst weapon in Mega Man 3, but that would make this entire entry a lot more depressing than even your average Twitter scroll. This only leaves us with Gemini Man and Top Man's weapons. Gemini Man's weapon is that giant laser beam that looks really cool and bounces off all the walls. The problem is that it's slower than your local gas station's public Wi-Fi, and you can only have a single laser beam on screen at one time, which means if you miss your target, your laser will just bounce around the room, wasting time and lagging lagging the game while you're unable to do anything at all except for just look at the boss while you probably die. This seems like more than enough logic to make it the worst weapon in the game, but the problem is Top Man's weapon is basically unusable. So this thing is just random. You're supposed to be able to jump in the air and spin like a top, which I guess is supposed to do damage, but it's horrible. First of all, you can't attack at all while standing or even running because your attack only works midair, but also it's basically random whether or not you take damage, do damage, or just run out of all of your weapon energy whenever you do end up landing a hit with this bogus weapon. As a kid, I didn't even think this thing worked. I thought either the game or the weapon was just glitched forever, since if you try pressing the shoot button without being in the air, nothing happens. But now that I'm adult and understand how this weapon is supposed to work, I hate it even more.
I find it weird that you don't mention how Top Spin can kill Gamma Phase 2 in one hit, but mention how Bubble Lead was needed to defeat Alien Wily, or Atomic Fire killing Woodman in 1 or 2 hits based on the difficulty.
That was an entirely different game with an entirely different weapon selection, so you can't really make these kinds of comparisons. What's going to be impressive in one Mega Man game might not be impressive in another. In the case of Topspin, it's clear what set it over the edge was its unreliability. Yes, it does kill Gamma in one hit. That is true. However, unlike Bubble Lead and Atomic Fire, it's much more unpredictable if the damn thing's even going to work in the first place. Meaning, although it can be very impressive when it does function, it is not always going to, again compared to those two weapons which are incredibly reliable.
Say what you will about Topspin, in fact I agree with most of the stuff you bring up here, but at least it deals damage.
Again, when you can get the weapon to actually do what it's supposed to, which this person was arguing, seemed to be a rather rare occurrence.
You know which weapon doesn't deal damage? Spark Shock. For those that don't know, Spark Shock is a weapon that stuns enemies in place and nothing else. You can't swap to a different weapon and kill stun enemies, it cannot deal damage, and there are no benefits in stunning most enemies since a majority of them require killing in order to progress. The only times to use Spark Shock in its best ways are enemies in midair and then sliding underneath them, but at that point, just slide underneath them. Why handicap yourself just to get past one enemy?
Now, all of those are issues with Spark Shot, I do agree, however, and I cannot stress this part enough, the main reason he came to the conclusion that Topspin was worse had to do with the fact that at least Spark Shot regularly does what it's supposed to do, while with Topspin it's much more of a gamble. Now, if you disagree with that reasoning, that's perfectly fine. However, you haven't actually debunked it at any point in your interjection. Instead, you've just ignored it.
Brightman has a nerfed version of Flashman's power where you can do a flash and everything on screen freezes for a few seconds. I'm not sure why Flashman's power lasts for the entire health bar while Brightman's power only freezes time and flashes, but I wish they were swapped because it seems backwards, just with the words flash and like bright, I don't know. Like flash should be quick, right? Flash should be the one that's like limited and not your entire health. I don't know, never mind. Brightman actually did improve the general ability somewhat though by letting you fire your gun while time is frozen, unlike Flashman's poopy weapon.
What?
I will not tolerate this Flash Stopper slander. I genuinely have to ask, how on earth is Flash Stopper a nerfed version of Time Stopper? If anything, Flash Stopper is an improvement in every regard to Time Stopper. Not only do you have the ability to shoot with the Mega Buster as time is frozen, but can also use it multiple times when playing through stages, compared to Time Stopper where the entire energy bar it has to be used in one go. Plus, it retains the exact same time stop ability Time Stopper has, so calling Flash Stopper a nerfed equivalent is inaccurate.
You see, there are two reasons why he might refer to it as a diet time stopper, because although you are right, it does have some advantages, it also has quite a few disadvantages when compared to Time Stopper. Among them, that a single use of Flash Stopper is actually a lot shorter than a single use of Time Stopper, even if the Flash Stopper does use less energy. Given a single use of Time Stopper lasts for 10 seconds, while a single use of Flash Stopper only lasts for 5. Time Stopper also freezes obstacles and the level more generally, while Flash Stopper only freezes enemies. And given he specifically mentioned how many people use Time Stop to dodge the lasers in Quickman stage, it's easy to see why a weapon which would not freeze them appears to be an inferior equivalent.
Starman's weapon is another doo-doo shield.
Apparently carrying over almost all of Skull Barrier's properties and having the ability to be tossed makes it a doo-doo weapon. Okay.
I mean, yeah, he didn't like Skull Barrier, so obviously he's not going to like a weapon with mostly the same properties. What's confusing about that? What was the point of this interjection?
Mega Man 6 is the most polished Mega Man game on the NES, which would lead me to believe the weapons must be more balanced. And well, you know what, that's actually right. There aren't many weapons that are great, but there also aren't many weapons that are totally garbage. This game does have another one of those flash the screen for a second and cause something minuscule to happen weapons, which you can get from beating Centaur Man. I'm not gonna say these kinds of weapons are necessarily bad, but I certainly don't like them. They don't always work, they seem kind of weird, they use too much weapon energy, and worst of all, this isn't even the worst weapon from Mega Man 6. Most of these weapons are just mediocre and do what they're supposed to do with some quirky little feature that differentiates them from the Mega Buster, like for example Nightman's spike thing that's a short-ranged boomerang-esque attack, Flame Man's weapon is one of those lob shots that spawns a flame tower on the ground, Blizzard Man's weapon tries as hard as it possibly can to dodge every single enemy you want to kill, and Wind Man's weapon usually doesn't work. But the worst weapon by far is unsurprisingly a shield weapon, which you get from Plant Man. Yeah, this weapon sucks. I'm sorry to all those Mega Man shield weapon community members out there, but shields in Mega Man don't usually work that great since the shield more often than not does very little damage, but also gets disintegrated at first contact with an enemy or their attack. This shouldn't be surprising to any Mega Man 6 fans though, because it's pretty clear Plant Man's entire design was based around making you as annoyed as possible, so having a flimsy shield as a weapon is par for the course. I mean seriously, if you think it's possible to think of a more tedious Mega Man 6 Robot Master than Plant Man, you're out of your mind because you just can't, man.
Odd how you mentioned that Plant Barrier or shield weapons in general not dealing much damage make them not good, when that's not the point of shield weapons. Now yes, you can use them as attacks, but that's not what they are meant for. They're meant to be used for defensive purposes and to protect you from projectiles and smaller enemies. Your point about them instantly disappearing after getting hit once is intended to be a drawback, and even then it's quick and easy to set up another one in most cases.
Unless you run out of weapon energy, which can happen if you use it multiple times in the same level, or if you're repeatedly getting hit because you're in an area where there are a lot of enemies and projectiles, also known as an area where you'd most want a shield in the first place. Although I do understand what you mean, you're ignoring the fact that this specific drawback causes the weapon to basically become useless after a while. Not only because of their lack of offensive abilities, but also due to how easy they are to destroy.
Mega Man 7 was the first classic Mega Man game to appear on a console other than the original NES, and with the improvements of the Super Nintendo, Capcom also decided to improve some of the weapons you get from defeating Robot Masters. Of course, Mega Man 7 started that stupid thing where you only get to choose the first 4 bosses until you beat those guys, only to be greeted by the final 4 bosses, which in all honesty does take away some value from a few of these weapons since you aren't able to get them as early. But this is one of the only Mega Man games where I think every single weapon is at the very least good. Also, as a side note, I recently found out there's a password you can put in that lets you choose all 8 Robot Masters from the start without having to beat any of them, but since no one told me about this until I was 21 years old, I'm just going to count using passwords as cheating. The Junk Shield weapon is the first shield weapon I've ever seen that's not only not garbage, but actually extremely good. This could arguably be the best weapon from Mega Man 7 if I'm being honest, but that's for another video. Freeze Man's weapon is just a significantly upgraded version of Blizzard Man's weapon from Mega Man 6, which is pretty nice. Cloud Man just gives you a regular ball of electricity to mess around with, Turbo Man gives you flame wheels, Slash Man gives you the ability to slash, and Vampire Man, Shade Man, gives you this weird sound attack that gains power when bouncing off of walls, which I think is honestly a really cool idea. Unfortunately, this cool idea is actually used to exploit how the game functions and can be used to one-hit kill a few bosses, but if you're asking me, that just makes this weapon even better.
So this part is interesting because it brings up something that I want to ask. Should glitches count in what should be considered the worst weapon? With the mentioning of glitches, this could affect choices, and this should have been something to mention much earlier on. By this logic, Hyper Bomb shouldn't be considered the worst weapon of Mega Man 1 because of the pause screen glitch.
Wait, why? Because the Hyper Bomb isn't the only weapon that you can use the pause screen glitch with. You can do it with any weapon in the game. Meanwhile, the weapon being discussed here has an exploit that can only be used with it due to how it gains power while bouncing off of walls. And that's not even getting into the fact that this weapon probably wouldn't be considered the worst anyway, given he called it a cool idea and made it clear he enjoyed using it, with the added exploit just being icing on the cake, essentially.
Rockman and Forte, more commonly known as Mega Man in Base in the West, is one of my favorite Mega Man games, which you guys may not understand since I hate Mega Man 8, but just let a man have an opinion every once in a while, alright?
Okay.
This game has a lot of really cool weapons, with some of my personal favorites in terms of creativity in the entire series. For example, I really like the ice wall weapon you get from Coldman, since it seems very unorthodox and counterintuitive to use, but the more you mess around with it, the more uses you'll end up finding. Mega Man also can use air bending with Tengu Man's weapon, shoot a giant drill that turns into a bunch of smaller but just as deadly drills, shoot cards that go through walls that bring you items, make shadow clones, shoot bombs, and much more. But there's one weapon I've never liked, which is the flamethrower weapon. Again, this is a really cool idea, and I do enjoy seeing Mega Man wielding what is basically a flamethrower on his arm, but in terms of usefulness, this just ain't it. I've seen a couple of Mega Man noobs try to claim that the electric weapon you get from Dynamo Man that clears the screen of enemies is by far the worst, but if you're actually a Mega Man expert such as I, then you would know that exact lightning weapon is used for frame-perfect and pixel-perfect zips used to skip some of the longest and most tedious stages of the final levels during speedruns, so if anything, that's probably one of the best weapons in the game.
Alright, so you guys may have noticed in the thumbnail that there was a fundamental flaw with this video, and now is the perfect time to go over that. This video's criteria for what is the worst Mega Man weapon is extremely lacking. For a video like this, setting up a well-defined criteria matters because it's a good reference for what is and isn't a good weapon. The only aspects of it in this video include not counting the regular Buster Shot and going in numerical order. That's it. For a video about this topic, it must have a well-defined criteria in order to come to a better conclusion.
But you just said what the criteria was. It must be defined for that to be the case. You can feel it's way too on the lax side all you want. However, that doesn't change the fact that it was clearly explained to the audience.
Some of the reasoning just simply isn't good, and I'll go over the 3 that motivated me to talk about this. Glitches as well as speedrun tactics shouldn't count because those weren't aspects to ever be intended by the developers, and in most cases aren't techniques players would use.
Okay, first off, glitches are something not intended by developers, that is true. However, speedrunning tactics aren't. Well, okay, they can be, but they also might not be depending on what exactly they are. Technically speaking, using the warp zone in the original Super Mario Bros. Is a speedrunning tactic, but that was still put there intentionally so the player could use it if they so chose. As for the notion that most players won't know about speedrunning tactics or glitches and that these were unintentional and therefore they shouldn't count, well, that just doesn't follow. He's not judging these weapons based off of how they were supposed to act in the game, nor is he judging them based off of how they're typically used during a playthrough. He's just judging them based off of how they appear in the game as a whole, therefore meaning any aspect of the weapon, including glitches and speedrunning tactics, should be on the table when discussing which weapon is best. Cyber goes on to make an okay point about the inconsistency in the list he's covering. The only issue is the aforementioned point about the pause glitch, which he repeats here, even though, again, the pause glitch isn't special to Hyper Bomb, meaning it can't really be compared to any of the other weapons which have glitches that only apply to them.
You mentioned that Mega Ball wouldn't be the worst weapon in Mega Man 8 since you considered that more of an item, but you never stated that you would only be considering weapons you get from Robot Masters. So would that mean items like Wire from Mega Man 4 and the Super Arrow from Mega Man 5, items that can deal damage, be possible choices?
Probably not, given he would also consider those more items than weapons, just like he does Mega Ball. I should also note that this statement implies that Mega Ball cannot do damage, which is just wrong. It's the weakness to 2 different bosses. And you can even beat Mega Man 8 using the Mega Balls exclusively, as Game Champ did. Anyway, that's all I want to cover, so final thoughts. Although this video wasn't terrible, it did have quite a few issues, as seen by the fact that I have spent over 20 minutes covering it. Good night, and good luck.